1 in every 4 people do not shower every day. That's you and your homies. One of y'all ain't showering. Is it you? Okay, that shower stat was false, but I bet I'm not that far off. 1 in every 4 people? Like, folks be like,
why I gotta shower every day? I ain't even do nothing to make me sweat.
Summer is over, the fall is here. That means cuffing season is over, and couch potato season is about to be in full swing. Now, what can we do to refrain from becoming a full-blown couch potato? We gotta exercise. We gotta move around. Now, we gotta wear a mask in the gym, that's the rules, but I've been seeing people exercising, running outside, in the city, in the forest, masked up over the nose and the mouth. And I'm thinking to myself, that can't be healthy for us, right? But let's look into the facts, that's why we're here. Also, I'm not talking about workout masks, we can talk about their efficacy another day. I'm talking about these. Breathing is measured in something called the minute respiratory volume. This is how much gas goes in and out of your lungs per minute. A normal breathing rate is about 7.5 liters per minute. When you exercise, that breathing rate can go up to 120 liters per minute. That's a big difference. Wearing a mask while doing nothing is a lot different than wearing a mask while working out. When you exercise, you need more air, plain and simple. The WHO actually recommends we don't wear a mask while we exercise because it can reduce our ability to breathe comfortably. I can't speak for everyone, but I actually don't wear my mask over my mouth and my nose when I'm in the gym. I just wear it over my mouth because, you know, regulations. I'm doing more work, I need more air, so I just pull it down because I'm breathing heavy, and for me, that makes a huge difference. We understand that having things cover your mouth and nose, your breathing pathways, it can obstruct your breathing. That does make sense. But what about the people that make the claims, hey, I'm not getting all the oxygen I need, or I'm recycling my carbon dioxide? Newspapers are quick to hop on this. That's a myth. No, not true. That's incorrect. And generally speaking, yes, our blood O2 and CO2 levels are generally the same with or without a mask. But there's levels to this.
There's levels to this! There's levels!
Researchers took pregnant healthcare workers, fitted them with N95 respirators, and instructed them to do 15-minute semi-moderate exercise. They found a 13.8% decrease of oxygen volume and a 17.7% decrease in carbon dioxide volume. You remember the way we measure our breathing? They found those decreases because there was an overall decrease of their minute respiratory volume by 25.8%. They also found there was an increase of CO2 production because we have to breathe a little harder when we wear masks. Another study looked specifically at CO2 rebreathing when doing an exercise bout on a stationary cycle. They found that 1 out of 3 of their 40 participants experienced at least 2% CO2 intake in their mask. All right, now I'm gonna stop boring you. I'm sorry. There were a lot of studies that were similar to these, but here's the kicker. All of those studies were using respirators. Respirators are not your typical mask. They are a lot more face-fitted and a lot more sealed. Ain't nobody running around with one of those on. This is what I meant by there's levels to this. CO2 and O2 particles are dummy small, so they will successfully travel to and fro through your mask to keep your blood levels normal. But that does not mean your overall air intake is normal. Every mask to some degree will affect your breathing. The tighter and more face sealed it is usually better, but it comes at the cost of chances of higher CO2 rebreathing and a lower minute respiratory volume. And I know we'll be coming home with the headaches and the feelings of dizziness after wearing our masks for hours. If you feel like you can't breathe, take that shit off. Side note, I'm also happy the WHO mentioned that a wet mask promotes the growth of microorganisms. This is what I was talking about in my last video when I mentioned the little microbe get-togethers in your mask. No? Anyways, as you can see, we have room for potential problems when we're wearing a mask doing nothing. Let's not wear them when we need as much air as we can get. I'm gonna get about y'all way. Have a good one.